Jeff, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So we have some complex themes that we'd like to dive into today. But before then, one thing that we really believe in at HXA is that good dialogue happens when people know each other and know something about one another. And given our topic tonight, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what guided you into higher ed and what you consider to be your first intellectual loves. What are the things that inspired you and still inspire you today to do what you do?
So yeah, thank you. I agree, by the way. People are the best conversants, and to really know someone is to really, I think, better understand them. I grew up in the Midwest, American Midwest. I grew up in a little farming community in Nebraska. And when I was young, shortly after adolescence, I became uber pious. I mean, I was so pious, you would have not have liked me. No one liked me, actually. I was super, super pious. And I also developed what I thought was a vocation to the priesthood or to the monastery. And so I became very interested in the monastic life. And I ended up in a monastic seminary in Missouri, studying to become a monk. I admired the lives of monks, their balance of work and prayer and contemplation and their community. And I very much wanted to be a monk. And so I was trained by monks. I was trained by monks with PhDs, Benedictines. And my first intellectual loves were really New Testament criticism, where my mind really opened up, I think, for the first time, realizing that the Gospels and the Pauline letters were not entirely what they seemed to be, and that it was okay to use our minds. It was a good thing. But also Freud, frankly. I was introduced to psychoanalysis in the seminary as well, both reading Freud, but also being psychoanalyzed. And I found the discovery of what I would call the unconscious to be profound. And it really pushed this insight that people's religious behaviors were certainly religious, but were also other things. And sometimes things that they themselves were not aware of. And that was really, I think, the beginning of my intellectual life, is to sort of dig down below and see other realms of human behavior and human experience that maybe weren't entirely obvious. So that was really the beginning.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear you talk about religious experiences that might not be classified as such in a certain tradition. And also vice versa. You and I had chatted in an earlier conversation about experiences that we don't typically associate with religious or spirituality. That why not? Why wouldn't we include them? You hadn't shared in our prior conversation that you started with an interest in entering the monastical life. I did too. I remember writing, this is so dweeby of me. So everyone listening, I recognize I'm a nerd, but I wrote in my binder in something like 9th grade, archaeologists and monks rule. I want to do something related to that. Similar story though, where it was encounters with one of the core objects of monastical life, the preservation of text and book. Yeah. For me, I was just blown away by the beauty of we can go with things like the Book of Kells or an experience with a text of Shakespeare's that I could only describe as awe or an experience with the sublime, and thinking something is happening here that is, as you said, diverting my course and sending me in a direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things the monks taught me was that reading can become a spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. You know, their notion of lectio divina or divine or contemplative reading, of course, usually applied to biblical texts, but it could be expanded out. And I think that was another kind of mini revelation I had, was that reading can change you in fundamental ways.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And to sort of edge this into higher ed a little bit. So a point that you've made in your writing and in our prior conversations is that these kinds of experiences we're talking about, whether they are recognizably religious and spiritual for good or for ill, and this other realm of experience that is parapsychological, leads many into the academic life, whether or not that theme persists throughout their academic journey. It is often one of the gateways in. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So actually, the second book I wrote, which was probably the book I wanted to write when I wrote the dissertation, was on the mystical experiences of scholars of mysticism. And the basic argument is that people who study mystical literature for a life don't do that out of objective or neutral motivations. They're driven to do that out of their own mystical and often anomalous experiences that don't actually fit in to any particular religious tradition, but are often catalyzed or influenced by, nevertheless, a particular religious tradition. And so they kind of back into the comparative study of religions in a way, just trying to make sense of themselves, essentially, and trying to ask the basic question: how did this happen? And what does this mean? And, I often joke with my students and my colleagues. I mean, scholars of religion are strange creatures. If you're entirely and comfortably religious, you of course seldom become a scholar of religion. Why would you do that? Why would you question religion? On the other hand, if you're entirely secular and think religion's nothing but a bunch of bunk, then why on earth would you become a scholar of religion? So intellectuals who study religion tend to be really conflicted and ambivalent and tortured in some really productive and creative way. Where I speak for myself here, I'm obsessed with religion, and I'm deeply religious, but I don't particularly have a religion that I would want to sign my name to. And that third space, which I'm trying to describe, I think is really productive, and I think it's what's produced the professional study of religion, frankly.
It's fascinating, and because much of a conversation is focusing on ideas, I want to focus on students for a moment. Speaking as a student, one-time student who experienced a faith-based institution and then several purely secular institutions, I think there's also an interesting dynamic in where you describe purely religious or purely secular, where our institutions have a hard time not being either of those things. The faith-based schools, right? And in my experience was that my faith-based institution and others are very open, to a variety of perspectives that enriches our dialogue. But there is a kind of orthodoxy and presence on campus that this institution aligns with this. Or most secular institutions, this institution maybe it once did and certainly does not anymore. And there are varying gradations of that. How do you help your students who are walking onto a campus like yours begin to grapple with the way that the cultures may be conditioning them to identify a certain way, and their own ambivalences? Transition to college is tough. It's never easy. What are your processes with the classroom and making that space comfortable for that third space you're talking about?
Well, I teach our big survey course. We just call it Reli 101, but it's an intro undergraduate circus to the entire panoply of religious studies. And
Sure.
when I first started teaching it back actually in Western PA, I would take these students through all these very powerful, reductive kind of social scientific methods and basically just confuse the heck out of them. And then we would send them home for Christmas. And I felt guilty after a while. I thought, this is not right. And I felt like they needed some kind of a resolution, maybe not a permanent one, but certainly some kind of resolution before we sent them on their way. Because obviously most of these students would only take one religion class in their life, and this was it. And so I felt it was a bit irresponsible to just deconstruct and end there. A colleague of mine there named Brian Rennie suggested forming the course around an initiation ritual that is studied by anthropologists like Arnold van Gennep. And so that's what I did. So I divided it into three parts. There's sort of pre-initiation, where I talk about the history of the study of religion. And there's then this actual liminal space where we do just confuse the heck out of everyone. But then there's this third section of the course where we come out of the liminality and we have the students redefine their worldview, and we give them options. I give them options. I give them religious options. I give them secular, social, scientific options, and I give them my own answers to these questions. But I don't tell them how to put the pieces together, but I give them the tools to do that and encourage them to do that. And I've found over the years, I've taught that course that way for almost 25 years now. Young people really respect that. If you tell them up front, look, these are the three steps, and it's going to get scary in the middle, but we're going to kind of get out of that at the end. You know, when they come to me in October and say, I'm afraid or I'm angry, I'm like, of course you are. I mean, don't you remember what I told you? And they're like, yeah, you did. You told us. And I said, just hang on, hang in there. And usually, not always, Kyle, but I'd say 90% of the time, they're quite pleased with how things turn out. They don't have final answers, but they feel a kind of like they've been through something. And that's what I want them to go through. I want them to go through that sense of questioning, but I don't want to just leave them in a kind of limbo or no person's land.
Yeah. I love the way you described that. So this is definitively not a safe space, the way that modern sort of media likes to shallow out that phrase. But it's also not a kind of bullheaded, this stuff is hard, get over it. I really like that you provide, there is security here, but there's also invitation to get uncomfortable, to disagree constructively, to meet viewpoints that are utterly different from your own. But with that trust that you build trust with your students so that they are trusting that you're taking them through a journey that's worth pursuing, right?
And it's not, Kyle, it's not safe for the secular STEM student either. And I tell them that, I'm like, look, I don't care what your worldview is. This is not safe. And I'm going to challenge your STEM world as strongly as I'm going to challenge your religious world, whatever it might be. And, they really respect that as well in general. And when they, of course, always ask me, well, what happened to you? Or what do you think? And I just tell them, I practice this vulnerability because I think at the end of the day, we are all vulnerable, and we actually don't know the answers to a lot of these questions that we say we do. And so I want to model that for these 18 and 19-year-olds who are just coming out of their families, just coming out of their homes. I mean, they're at a really plastic kind of stage of life that we can really, really work with if we do it right.
Yeah, that's great. I love the idea of giving them that menu almost first off, rather than them sorting out, here's how I'm expected to believe. That's great to hear. In your writing and in conversation, you make the great point that people arrive on campus with a whole bevy of beliefs, and often our discussions about diversity and inclusion get at vitally important aspects of our identity, race and class and gender and sexual orientation and more. Heterodox has recently taken up the discussion of religious diversity. You use a different term though. You like talking about ontological diversity, and especially how it manifests in higher ed. And I think we're talking about it already, but do you mind sharing a bit more what you mean by that and what the pitfalls are of not recognizing the wide diversity of beliefs about reality itself that might be in your classrooms or in your discipline or in your department as you're mounting a research project?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not that I don't mind talking about it. It's really all I want to talk about. I mean, this is what I've been thinking about for years. The first 15, 20 years of my career was all about sexual orientation and gender within the religions. So I say that because I really want to embrace the critical theories of the humanities. I understand them, I've read them, I've practiced them, I've actually suffered for them.
Mm.
I really have. But over the years, I've grown increasingly concerned that when we talk about diversity, we're really not talking about diversity. We're assuming that everyone is a material body and is a social actor and has a completely historically conditioned ego, and that's all we are. And if we talk about religious diversity, we're just talking about a set of beliefs, a set of kind of cognitive assertions that are attached to this historically conditioned physical body, and we're nothing else than that. And what strikes me so powerfully is that, that's likely not true. And the entire history of religions is one huge witness against that. Mm. The religions are very much about some other aspect of the human or the superhuman or the non-human that is not the body, that is not the historically conditioned social ego. And to the extent we don't talk about that or we won't imagine that, I think we just end up affirming our own secular social scientific ontologies, and we will not think truly or imagine truly with these alternative ontologies, by which I mean things like reincarnation or emptiness or the soul or God or the gods or magic or all of these things that our histories are just rife with, that we just won't really think about. We'll give them lip service, we'll describe them historically, but we don't take them seriously. And I just can't do that anymore. I think that's morally wrong. And I think it's ontologically false. I think the world we live in is incredibly weird. And usually the only language that comes close to describing it is frankly religious language. So that's what I mean by ontological diversity. I mean, you're not who you think you are, nor am I. And we communicate in ways that are mind-boggling and on levels that no secular or scientific or rational model could even come close to describing.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. One thought is to circle back to our comments on awe earlier. I distinctly remember sitting in a grad seminar, and no criticism of my graduate program. I loved it. It made me who I am in so many ways. But you're talking about that ways of communicating with one another that are not what we expect, especially in academia. But we were pooling around King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, and multiple of us got to a point in the conversation where we started sharing what got us into studying that work to begin with. And it was positively intellectual. It was my moment of awe, talking about experiencing a book. Someone else described reading a text and having this visceral response that there not being a mother figure in King Lear and them not having a mother growing up. And the whole room was tingly. People, my hair was standing on my neck. Just the chill of discussing something so central to my heart, not just my brain, others as well. And the tragedy of the moment, no criticism of the instructor in the room at all, was that that kind of moment is just not acceptable in a graduate seminar. We're there to talk about the footnotes to the play. We're there to talk about what hasn't been said about the play yet. And yet there was communication in that space. There was a deeply shared moment that I would have said deeply human, but you want to kind of push back on that and say, only if by human you mean something supramaterialist, something that can account for this thing here. You mentioned the humanities as well. I entered my discipline, which is the humanities and Shakespeare and British literature, because I had grown up expecting it to be more so the study of moral character and intellectual virtue. So sort of what the humanities in English was decades ago. And I was pleasantly surprised by what I found instead. Really exciting, fun things. And I love what I did. But I missed that. I missed the study of the humanities being about how we as human beings transform over time in ways that can't just be described to tribalism or social behavioralism. Is that what you're getting at in your critique of the humanities? And what am I missing? And where do you see the humanities growing if we expand our conception of the human?
So I would say it's weirder than that, Kyle. I mean, that's what I call the prophetic dimension of the humanities. This moral cry that lies at the heart of a lot of our critical theories. I often refer to the humanities as the study of us that changes us. It has this sort of reflexive kind of transformative nature to it. But when I talk about ontological diversity, I mean much more than that. I mean that loop, but I mean sometimes that loop is extended into time and somehow the future bends back into the present. I mean, people actually have precognitive dreams and precognitive experiences that feed into their literary creativity, for example. I'm thinking of someone like Mark Twain, who wrote explicitly about this, by the way. Or people have telepathic connections often with loved ones who are in danger or dying. And someone like Jacques Derrida wrote a whole long essay on telepathy at the end of his life, which, by the way, I can't get anybody to talk about. So it's these anomalous moments that words like precognition or telepathy or near-death experience or something, we have the categories for them, but we won't use them because they can't be slotted into our social scientific kind of completely social register where we're only material bodies in a social space. These are moments when we're clearly not just material bodies in a social space. We clearly transcend space and we transcend time. And that's part of the creativity and the basic ideas of the humanities. That's what the humanities are partly about, not all about. I would never say they're all about that. That's crazy.
Sure.
But they're certainly about that. Let me just give you a simple example. Cornel West talked about starring in some of the later Matrix movies, and he talked about how the actors were reading Schopenhauer and William James. Wow. Talk about the humanities. But if you go read Schopenhauer and you read his essay on spirit seeing, it's all about this transcendence of space and time. He even talks about his own precognitive dreaming. And if you read William James, and you really read him, I don't mean just read varieties, I mean really read William James, you recognize that this was no simple psychologist or pragmatist that people want you to think. This was a psychical researcher who spent a lot of his life sitting with mediums and psychics and people that we wouldn't want to associate with today. And he was also taking psychedelic, we call them drugs, but I mean, he was inhaling nitrous oxide and he was chewing peyote buttons, and James was doing everything in his power to alter his consciousness, to alter his mind and body. And he was writing out of these altered states. And that's how you get William James, or that's how you get Arthur Schopenhauer, or that's how you get W.E.B. Du Bois, or that's how you get Gloria Anzaldúa. You get these major humanist writers because they were writing out of their altered states of mind and body. And so that's the argument of the superhumanities. And to kind of flag something we'll talk about in a bit is there is this superhuman, or this other dimension to the classical literature in the humanities that produces it. It's not tangential. It's not optional. It's actually at the core of our basic texts and our basic ideas.
So that's fascinating. So when we spoke earlier this month, I was imagining the superhumanities as sort of as accidentally what you described as prophetic, sort of what comes next. But what I'm hearing now is almost a recovery project as much as what comes next. It is a shifting of some of our materials into the register in which they were born out of. I see what we call the religious turn in humanities and English literature specifically, which is going on the last 20 years or so, as a perfect example, but also symptom of what you're describing here. There's been interest in the last 20 years in taking religious contexts and authors seriously, as in not recoding religion as a representation of social class or political dynamics, that kind of thing. And that's all well and good, but it's been such a slow process to have happen. And it's continued to be embedded in the non-human. So for instance, discussion of how Shakespeare played with the sacraments, the Christian sacraments of his era. Big question is the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ. Does the bread actually become the body and blood of Christ? Are we actually shifting into a different register of being here? That conversation has tended to center around book history and how the page, the physical page, actually behaves humanly or guides us. And that's a fun conversation to have, but it's still sort of sidestepping the reality that William Shakespeare likely believed, whether the state told him to or he did naturally, that when he sat in church on Sunday morning, that bread became a deity. It became the divine. What does it look like to actually take him at his word? Recognizing that there's maybe questions about his who he was. What does it mean to actually do that, right? I remember discovering somewhere along the line, a lot of the authors I was reading, historical authors I was reading, whose work was being anthologized in social and political dynamics, also wrote hymns, lots and lots of hymns. And that was intellectually meaningful work to them, the same as the manifestos that I was engaging in. How do we do this? Maybe this leads us into the book, but how do we help students recognize these registers boldly? How do we help departments be spaces where people don't feel marginalized when asking these kinds of questions? How did you make this space for yourself as a scholar? And what's the road to expanding these recognition of these spiritualities?
So let me say something fairly local and then say something more global. First of all, I often joke there are no good words in the study of religion. They're all abused words. What ritual, mysticism, myth, and most of these words are basically come out of dogfights between Catholics and Protestants.
Sure.
Right? And so the Eucharist is a perfect example. I mean, it sounds like we both grew up Catholic, and so we both grew up with the real presence. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a symbol. It was the real presence. And I think what's happened in the academy is it's very Protestant. It reads religious language and religious experience as pure metaphor that can be translated into something non-religious or present. I don't buy that, actually. I think we're very good at talking about absence today after the postmodern turn, but we're terrible about talking about presence. Someone like Bob Orsi, who's a scholar of Roman Catholicism at Northwestern, has written beautifully about the history of presence and what he calls abundant history, by which he basically means really, really weird things happening to people. And they really happen. And guess what? It's historical. These things have agency. Marian apparitions have agency.
Sure.
Miraculous healings have agency. They do real work in the real world. We can't just treat them as metaphors or as discourses. That's all about absence. That's all Protestant. And that's not to bash on the Protestants. I'm very Protestant in many ways myself, but I'm just saying that's a Catholic Protestant thing. If we just explode out of that, I was trained in India and with India, and the whole Catholic Protestant thing makes no sense. It's just irrelevant there. And you have constant forms of presence, though. You have endless models of the human that are ontologically diverse. You get almost no models that restrict the person to the social and political plane. And so these were the ontological traditions and models that I was really trained in. And I see the European Catholic Protestant dogfights as just kind of petty and local. So I think we have to be much more global about this and not just assume a European Protestant real. I think we really have to break out of that. Let me say this too, Kyle. When I was in the seminary, one of the things I heard a lot is that, Roman Catholicism's true because the miracles show that it's true, and the saints demonstrate the truth of the tradition. So I once believed that. But then, of course, I saw or read about miracles and saints from completely different traditions that were establishing completely different realities and completely different religions. And I realized at some point that actually these anomalous capacities of human beings is precisely what's universal. And the way they get framed doctrinally or culturally is what's historically relative and specific. And so this is why I go on and on about paranormal events, because I think they're in fact universal and they don't really change much. But how they're picked up or disciplined or denied or cultivated or interpreted changes dramatically from culture to culture. And so my comparative method is really a kind of anomalous or paranormal method. I look at the universality of these experiences and then try to understand how they get shaped in different ways in different cultural frames. Yeah. So it's an affirmation of sameness and difference, but it's locating the sameness not on the social level or the political level or the moral level, but on this sort of anomalous level that we know about, but have a hard time admitting today.
Like experiential level, really, sort of what people say happened.
Yeah, and people today, Kyle, I mean, once you start writing about this stuff, of course, people start talking to you and they tell you their stories. And I mean, my email box is filled every week with the strangest things. And I frankly believe not all, but most of these people, these things happen to them and they are completely traumatized by them often because they don't fit into any cultural or religious register. And so that's kind of if I can speak morally for a moment, that's the compassion from which my own work emerges, is a sympathy with those people. And I mean people. I don't mean abstractions. I mean, living people whose names and email and often phone numbers I have. Um, so that's really what I'm trying to get at is let's get real here and let's recognize the real is not what we think it is.
Yeah, yeah, that really speaks to my mind and my heart, in that I think one of the practices that's most missing in higher ed is intellectual charity, which is among the values that we talk about in the HXA way. So, but not to tout the HXA way, but just to speak to intellectual charity in and of itself. When I think about what I want to be different about the academy in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, I think about my own children. And I ask myself, when they walk onto campus and they have a situation where they are sharing an anomalous moment of their own, maybe it's religious and related to their upbringing, or maybe it's something else. And maybe it's not an anomalous moment. Maybe it's just a thought that goes against the orthodoxy. I sincerely hope that the response to the people around them, students and faculty, is, that is so fascinating. Can you tell me more? Not what, or that's interesting, and let's move on. So it sounds to me like to pivot the conversation back towards sort of just like daily classroom practice and the person in the office next to you. A lot of what's called for here is greater intellectual charity to reprogram our knee-jerk reaction in the critical academy to be certainly space to say, wow, that's different, whatever it is. Something as simple as a traditional religious belief, which I think we need more room for, all the way up to sort of parapsychological experiences you're describing, to say, I want to hear more and learn more about that. What would you say to two groups of people? What would you say to a student or an instructor or a faculty member who wants to share more about some element of their upbringing or their experience that they feel shuddered by? And what would you say to, I'm thinking about the culture makers, to the chairs of departments, to the instructors, to the section leaders and instructors of these gigantic survey courses who see these students before most of the rest of us do? What can they do? What can they do today? What can they do tomorrow to start this cultural shift you're talking about?
Well, I'm very aware that we live and we work under a set of disciplines or categories that preceded us. I'm very Foucauldian in some ways. We are not free to think, we're thought. And we're not free to believe, we're believed, essentially. And so when I'm training students, I'm very aware that the job market, let's get really practical. The
Sure.
job market is not kind to any of this. There are no jobs in this. You have to frame your intellectual project in traditional ways and then do this inside or within that project. And so, I use please forgive the gendered nature of this parable, but I use a pop cultural parable, and whether it's a male or a female or a transgendered student, I say, look, I know you're Superman, but I'm going to train you to be Clark Kent. And yes, you can go in the phone booth and you can turn back into Superman and fly away, and you should, but you also have to go to the Daily Planet and write boring stuff every day that you don't really want to write.
Sure.
You have to learn how to shift back and forth between the superhuman and the human, and maybe that just means taking your glasses off and flying away and then putting them back on. I don't know. But the point is we live in different political and social environments, and we have to adjust ourselves to those different spaces and the conversations that they make possible. Now, that's the pragmatic or the practical advice. The pedagogical advice is, I try to be a teacher, and I want my students to be teachers in which any and all of these conversations are not only allowed, but encouraged.
Sure.
And I want to make the classroom a safe space that people can talk about their most astonishing and their most superhuman experiences. And I bring experiencers into the classroom, Kyle. I mean, I bring people in and I just have them tell their stories. And the students are inevitably deeply moved by that. They actually don't believe me after a while. They think, oh, that's weird, Professor Kripal doing his weird thing. And then I bring someone in who basically says the same thing. And they're like, oh, wow. Maybe he has a point, maybe it's not all so crazy. So that's my advice, is we have to be pragmatic and practical and understand where the culture is, but we also have to push the envelope, not just in our classrooms, but I think in our publications. And this is why I publish. It's not to accrue more cultural capital. It's to carve out a space in the forest so that we can build a fire and tell strange stories and, create a village at some point, and more people can then come in and tell their stories and create a better village and a better village. And I really believe that. I think we authorize future conversations by what we author today. And I really see scholarship in that generational sense. I do not see it as a kind of one-off.
Yeah. I hear so many things what you're saying. One of them is, for anybody out there who's listening or watching who is like me, when I see something that needs changing, I want to commit holistically to getting that change done as swiftly as possible, with all of my, my entire economy devoted to it, not a wasted penny. And basically, doing the Superman thing, getting up there and doing it. In pragmatic terms, if there are changes I want to make in the academy, what are the big projects we can do that can change people's minds tomorrow, right? What I'm hearing from you, from for those who are willing and wishing to speak in ways that are, no, I'll use the word heterodox, but also for chairs and people in positions of power, tenure promotion committees, chairs, deans, who have the power to create these spaces. It's not about rewriting the college vision tomorrow. It's about starting someplace small. I love that metaphor of the campfire, right? Creating a space so you can find who are the people who are not feeling heard right now and who really want us to understand the relationship of this experience, this moment, this historical register, and its pertinence to the conversations this college is having. So that those first steps are small. They're places of gathering to make things larger down the road possible.
And this earlier emphasis I put on the global, or what I call the comparative, it's so important. It's not about affirming difference for the sake of difference. It's about affirming ontological diversity and recognizing that sometimes the best places to go to see the real or to experience the real differently is in another culture that is nothing like your own. I really believe that. I really think there's two values of diversity. There's the kind of political or identity politics that's incredibly valuable, but there's also this deeper ontological diversity that can shift things, I think, even more dramatically. And that's why I so believe in comparison, is because I think it puts into question not just our social identities, our races, our genders, our sexual orientations. It puts into question what we think mind is and what we think matter is and how we think space, time, and causality function. Those are major things, and they do not operate the same in different cultures and communities and historical periods. And that's why I think we should be so interested in this. And that's what I'm just repeating myself, but I really think this is about the real. And of course it's also about the social, but it's also about the real. It's about
Yeah.
both.
This is your metaphor of the chessboard, that in some ways pluralism as currently understood, which is if we could even get to the point of practicing pluralism well, we'd be doing better than we are. But if pluralism is the belief that everyone should have equal space on the chessboard to move about and to dialogue and interact, and it's less about whose truth is right and more about is everyone on the board, you want to actually say, hey, guess what, not everybody on the board believes they're on a board or on a chessboard, right? And so how do we invite that conversation in ways that productively disrupt? At Heterodox we say constructively disagree, but productively disrupt,
So
right?
yeah, I've debated twice now at the university with evangelical leaders that the student groups brought, and they've asked me to debate these people, and I've happily done that, and they were both very rewarding experiences for me, actually. The last one I did, I gave this little lecture called The Chess Game, and this is where the metaphor comes from. When I was trained in the seminary, the radical forward-looking theological stance was what I would call ecumenical.
Mm-hmm.
And so you identify with a team on the chessboard and you relate to another team on the chessboard, but you never step out of your identity. You assume you're Roman Catholic, or you assume you're a Vaishnava Hindu or a Shia Muslim or whatever. And so, but you're always on this chessboard, and there are only so many moves you can make, and you never get out of that conflictual relationship. And where I've sort of landed as a historian of religions is I want to step up and away from that chess game and say, look, I actually don't identify with any of those pieces. I don't even want to play that game. You go play that game if you want, but guess what? There's always going to be winners and losers to it. Always. Because those are the rules of that game. And so what I'm trying to say is we don't need to play that game. We can play a different game, or we can not play a game at all, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I'm just blabbing here. But you see the difference. There's a fundamental, and this is why I have such a difficult relationship to religion. It's not that I want to affirm a particular religion over another religion. It's that I want to understand all of those religions on the chessboard, but not identify with any of them, because I don't like the game. I don't like a game in which people win and lose. And I don't know what the other game is, Kyle. It's not like I have answers here. These are just questions or concerns that have developed over the last few decades for me personally.
Yeah, maybe we don't know what the next game is or what comes after the game, but higher ed sure seems like the place to figure it out. I mean, so much going on campus. And I think as we continue to have the current pluralism discussion and find better ways to even ensure that different groups are welcome with their beliefs on campus, also asking this question, pushing beyond that and saying, okay, so once we're all there, let's say that we arrive at a point where all identities, all religious representations that wish to be present and actively practicing and have their ideas welcome in class, let's say we get there. Okay, it's great. Now what? Right? What comes after that?
Right.
I mean, to that end, we only really have a few more minutes here, which is terribly unfortunate, but your book coming out next year, the Superhumanities. I know we've touched on a lot of it here, but could you give a summary exposition of your vision for what's next?
Well, we've been talking about it all along.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
the Superhumanities are simply the humanities seen anew, but also seen as they've always been, but we've just not seen them that way. I mean, there's always been these superhuman characteristics to people like Schopenhauer or Du Bois or Ansel Dua or James or Huxley or anybody we want to name. Well, not anybody, but many people we want to name, they've had these sort of anomalous or extraordinary aspects to their life and their thought. And I simply want to lift those up and say, look, this is what it means to study the humanities. And to be really honest, I opened the book with this story. It's kind of a joke. When I was a kid, there were these really bad children's television variety shows on where basically it was kids on bleachers in a bare gym. And they go around the room and they ask the kids what they want to be. And the girls all say a nurse or a teacher, and the boys all say a policeman, an astronaut, or maybe a doctor. And I was like, why does no one want to grow up and become a professor of the humanities? And I was like, well, what if we called them the superhumanities? What kid would not want to grow up and become a superhuman? Of course, everybody would want to do that. And maybe we would fund the humanities as the superhumanities. Maybe they would attract funding. Maybe they would get more buildings that said superhumanities on the building and not just humanities. I mean, it would fundamentally change who we are and what we do and who wants to be a part of it. And so I really am thinking as a kind of administrator or fundraiser. I really believe in money. I really believe that financial resources create opportunities for real human beings, and that we need to do this for generations and not just for individuals or for particular schools.
Structural change, right?
Yeah, I really believe in long-term structural change, not short, quick fixes.
Yeah. You make me think that I did not want to grow up to be a humanities professor, but I did idealize J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis for the worlds they created, and thought, oh, they did English. So I will admit that's part of what. So that's a tangential connection there, but I also have spent my life looking longingly at the people studying the quantum realm, quantum dynamics, all these super exciting, mind-bending, reality-challenging things. And with this quiet assumption in my mind that, well, if you're a scientist, you get to do those things. And there are cool things you get to do as a humanist, awesome things that the STEM folks don't get to do. That's the beauty of the disciplines that Newman saw ages ago.
So
but
Kyle, I've spent many, many days and weeks with quantum physicists. I talk to quantum physicists regularly. It's what's fundamentally changing the religious imagination of the people I work with.
right.
And one of the arguments I've made, which I think you'll like, is that these human experiences of the anomalous are quantum effects scaling up into human experience. I mean, I really believe that. I really think that human beings are the ultimate quantum detector, and that we have capacities that only something weird and strange like quantum mechanics can begin to understand or frame. I don't want to create an identity there. I don't want to be too loose about that, but I think we're pushing into a new real here. And that's what the subtitle of the book means, by the way, New Realities. It really gestures towards the new quantum real and a kind of holism or connectedness or entanglement, whatever language you use, that goes way beyond these atomistic individuals competing for resources and conflicting over religious beliefs that we're working with now. That's really where I think we're headed, but we're so far from that. We are so far from that.
Sure. Well, you and I, to kind of wrap up here, you and I talked last time about our mutual love for the MCU, for Marvel, X-Men, and all these things. And how fascinating is it that the last 12 or 13 years, and at the same time we're having these cultural conversations about racial reckoning and experiencing the pandemic and sort of still, what does post 9/11 mean, that the MCU was born, this place that is visioning new humans, new ways of being and doing and relating, while still continuing to have very traditional conversations about, really, I say traditional, but universal and essential, about loyalty, about
and the X-Men, which is my favorite mythology,
Yeah,
as you probably know. I mean, that's us too. That's the humanities. That's Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, Magneto is Nietzsche. And so we've got the goods again. That's what I
sure.
mean by the superhumanities. We've got it. They're copying us, folks. We're not copying them. I wrote this chapter once called X-Men Before Their Time, and basically what it says is, well, this idea's been around for 150 years. This Marvel didn't invent this. Friedrich Nietzsche and Alfred Russell Wallace, and
Right.
they invented this. And so again, the humanities have the goods. We just have to be able to access them and talk about them in ways that people can hear.
Mm. And with much thanksgiving to our STEM colleagues for having these conversations with us. And
Well, yeah, the STEM. So take the X-Men again. You don't get the X-Men without evolutionary biology.
sure, right.
You just don't. You can't get there. You don't get Friedrich Nietzsche without Darwin.
Sure.
I mean, you can't separate the humanities and the sciences. You have to put them
Mm.
together.
Mm.
And that's part of the superhumanities.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and even understanding our current moment, I'm thinking about, even as we hear more talk of Delta COVID variants and Lambda COVID variants coming out. I mean, it's amazing to me every time I enter the news, the media stream, cautiously and with my protectors on. I'm required, if I want to do it well, I'm required to deploy liberal arts training, really. But what I've learned about the science is about how to read data sets, but also from the humanities, about understanding where a voice is coming from and what assumptions it's making about the people it's writing about. That there's a level of engagement with what's happening out there that we're still working towards training our students to engage well with, I think.
Yeah, in some of my mischievous moments, I'll often say that the sciences are really just subdivisions of the humanities. And people will look at me, or they'll laugh like you just laughed. And I'll say, well, have you ever met a scientist that wasn't a human being?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I haven't. So clearly all of science comes from human beings, which means we can use the humanities to try to understand it and deepen our view of it. The human comes first. The sciences come later. And I really believe that. And that's kind of this superhuman vision that I'm trying to articulate.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Fascinating. Well, Jeff, I would love to talk to you for hours and hours more on top of how we've already chatted, but we are nearing the end here. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this time and sharing so much of your thinking. And to everyone who tuned in, thanks so much for taking the time. We are excited for what this vision and for what our whole theme this summer about religious diversity hopefully means for the Academy moving forward. A greater viewpoint diversity for all of our classrooms, from STEM across to the humanities, and greater welcome for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary conversations that can ask new questions that require the traditional disciplines, STEM and humanities and social sciences, and questions that really blur those lines in important, vital ways. So thank you for tuning in. And Jeff, thanks again for joining us.
Hey, thank you. It was a pleasure.